are you?
I am Leigh Ann Hallberg, and I am an artist and an art educator. And I live in Winston-Salem, and yeah, that's who I am. Who are you?
I'm Paul Bright. I'm an artist, also in Winston-Salem.
In Winston-Salem. And what do you do for a living, Paul Bray?
I'm a gallery director at Wake Forest. And we actually share this space that we're in. We're two artists sharing a space and aren't killing each other.
Yeah, two artists sharing a space, sharing our art dog.
Yeah.
And
who has refused to take part in this conversation.
Yep. Oh, well.
Yeah.
What kind of art do you make, Paul?
So most of my work is collage. Collage, paper, sometimes sound. So collage as an approach rather than just a technique.
I draw, I make sculpture, but your approach to art making is collage, that is putting things together. Mine seems to be about seriality. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, that tends to be true with your work. And you tend to get in a groove doing a series of images that share a conceptual basis. And then you'll do another one. And sometimes there are linkages between them, and sometimes that's less clear. But yeah, you do work serially a lot.
But then you kind of do too.
Yeah, a little bit. For me, it's like one thing leads to another. They're not conceived as series, but if you look at a sequence of collages that I've done, you'll see materials that are shared between some of them. And it's because they've come off the board in a sequence, and that stuff was laying around, and I used it, and they do share that. And sometimes, there's a conceptual push from one to the next too, but it's not truly serial.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the size thing, and maybe again that's just from the materials that are available.
Yeah, the size thing, it depends a lot on the material available. And until recently, I wasn't able to get full sheets of posters and that sort of thing, or wasn't concentrating on that. The smaller work I was doing earlier was more geometrically abstract, and while it had sort of figurative elements in it, they weren't depictions of people. They were numeric figures or text figures. And now all of that's sort of come together, and it's opened up a different approach to the scale of things. But also with like the sound collages, they are sounds collected much like the paper is collected. Sort of as you move through the world and you see things or hear things that are interesting, you capture them, or you take them with you. And the collages themselves also have sort of subgroups, like I'm doing this ongoing, and these are a little more serial, I guess. Simple collages of more topical elements, so images from newspapers juxtaposed with an entirely different bit of text with an entirely different intent, but when they come together, they seem to illuminate each other a little bit. So that's sort of a sub-body of work.
More pared down. I wouldn't say simplified, but
yeah, there are fewer elements. It's usually 2 or 3 elements. They're smaller. They should be faster than the other ones. They aren't always. And then I did a photo essay a couple years ago that's also somehow rooted in collage and the found object. So everything I'm doing, in a sense, has this sort of conceptual or philosophical tie, you might say, of using what's available, being interested in the fragmentary quality of things and making new wholes out of those fragments. That's what kind of holds it all together.
Right, which is pretty reflective of what's happening right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because this idea of fragmentation that we all are so aware of now has been a concern of artists, I'd say, for the last 100 years or so, since the Industrial Revolution really took off and everything became packaged in units of time. Organic flows of life were disrupted by factory life, and everything that flows from that until today, when our screens are, throwing a million things at us at once. But only really want our attention for a critical 5 seconds before we're off to something else.
5 seconds, that seems like
It's
a long time.
It's a long time.
Two.
It's long enough to push the pay button.
The pay button, correct, yes.
So we live, it's clear that we live in very fragmented times now.
Right.
And it's a reflection of that, but hopefully in an ironic way, I guess, it takes those fragments and stops them for the moment of the piece itself so that you can spend time with it. You can spend hours with it, maybe, even though it's a fragmented thing that reflects our world.
And I think maybe my reaction to the fragmentation of existence right now is to sort of focus down. Like I did a series of drawings of cereal bags, the most banal kind of object, but the idea that in looking at them more carefully and understanding that they look different at different times, and we think when you see something you've got it, you understand it, and that really isn't the case. Where our way of seeing, the way the body physiologically perceives things has to do with basically staying alive. It's an evolutionary thing, and we often learn to just look long enough to get that second of information and discard the rest. So in drawing the cereal bag over and over and over, it was kind of about the impossibility of really truly understanding something, but how wonderful seeing is as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, sharing a studio space. I think both of us for a long time didn't see much cross-fertilization in an obvious way between our work, but I think after years of doing it now, that there are things that flow back and forth.
Definitely.
I think Leigh Ann's probably using more found materials or approaching the way she collects material or images is maybe more in line with what I do. And then in my work, the emergence of the figure in many cases probably has something to do with a lot of the figurative things she was doing. It's impossible to pinpoint where these things happen, but when you look back over years, it's like, oh, that's kind of like what you were thinking before, and there's a lot of cross-fertilization. And we should probably talk a little bit about the paintings you're doing now that really come out of a hybrid drawing practice. So let's talk about the phenomenological walks, which start as drawings in a way.
Yes. Well, I mean, if you want the whole big story, the studio dog is a rescue, Lola, and the dog just really needs, she's perked up now, a lot of outside time. And so I started giving her about an hour a day of outside time. And we spent a lot of time at Renolda House in the grounds and gardens. And I've always drawn trees and the natural world and been enthralled with it. And in these walks, or during these walks, that became even more apparent. And so I started shooting things in the natural environment that reflected both the natural world and the way humans perceive that world. And then as far, so that was the interest, and I just kind of through experimentation decided that I wanted to do watercolor using a kind of a natural material to reflect the natural phenomenon. And then, I mean, it does get kind of funny, complex, but thinking about space and time and perception, these drawings actually started emerging as a warp and a weft.
I'm going to pull back towards the work that's going to be in this exhibition of yours,
Oh,
which all grow out of the cereal bag drawings, are all versions of that, right? So,
right.
when you started drawing the cereal bags, what was the impetus for that? And do you see that as an ongoing project, or?
The cereal bags, I think I could draw for forever. It's just a matter of time and other interests that keep me away from them. Time is always a thing, but the books that are in the exhibition came from cereal bags, and they were just this banal kind of item. I eat cereal in the morning, and I kept looking at these bags and thinking about them. Did a fairly substantial group of these 4x4 drawings of cereal bags. And then I started thinking about John James Audubon and his Birds of America, which I think we had seen when we were looking at art someplace. And it just struck me as this sort of equivalent thing, Bags of America and Birds of America. And I tried to imitate, although because I couldn't find the materials, I tried to imitate John James Audubon's elephant-sized folio. I wasn't quite able to get there, but they're quite substantial.
In the one book, yeah. And then there are two other books that are smaller. One's like a little flip book of bag image as it kind of either comes together or decomposes.
Right. So part of it is shapes that overlays a line drawing, etc. And so again, that idea of sort of trying to figure something out or understand perception.
But the bag drawings started as sort of an intentional, habitual daily routine for you.
A mentor of mine and a dear friend suggested drawing every day, and it's a really wonderful exercise. I don't know if it's an exercise. It's what is it, Paul?
It's the way of beginning to look at the day in the world.
Yeah, and it's pretty darn wonderful. It takes a lot of fortitude to do that. I've asked my students to do it on occasion, but yeah.
Yeah, so, and initially you did 80 of them, as I remember.
Correct.
And they were presented together like a grid that related to a cubic structure that you also made at the same time that is composed in part of transparent plastic panels. So the transparent plastic bag of the typical cereal bag now, which it's ubiquitous, and it's like two companies make these bags. They're always the same now. So the cube, as we call it, reflected in part this enclosure, this translucent enclosure. So that's interesting too, and I think it's indicative of how things thread together in your work. It's not the same as the bag, but it's related to the bags. The bags at that time in their presentation were sort of modular. It was a grid of 80. The cube structure is modular, and it was a grid of 8 by 8.
And I think maybe part of the two things underlying both of those are the idea of contemplation, and because the cube, its official title is the Portable Contemplation Cube. So it is meant to be contemplative inside this structure, but also the translucency and semi-permeable membranes are just something that have always interested me. I think this idea of semi-permeable membranes really permeates so much of life, from medieval walls to cell membranes, to the crazy cereal bags where some light comes through, but
yeah.
Contemplation, semi-permeable membranes, time, space, nature.
Yeah, these are consistent things.
Perception.
And the cube was actually shown at SECA, 5 years ago maybe?
Something like that.
Yeah. So that's interesting too. The basis of all the work I'm currently doing and have for a while is the found object, um, and how to recombine fragmentary um, bits of our world that are found.
Do you consider putting that fragmentary bit as, do you consider it critique? The way Picasso considered it, well, I don't know if he considered it critique, but
Yeah, I mean, I think within a lot of the work, um, it's it's a dry humor, we might say. It's a dry critique. It's not a way of telling you how to think about the content of the piece or the images necessarily, because I think those are sort of richly ambiguous. But the way things are placed, or sometimes a bit of text will reflect back on the structure or the imagery within it. So it's not, I try not to make it a heavy-handed thing or even an obvious thing, but it's maybe a layer of the many layers in some of the works. A work like this one has less of that and less overt figuration, but it does crop up in them.
I mean, I think for me, they really do end up being kind of critique of late capitalism and the world, as in this case, I think kind of almost falling apart, especially when you literally incorporate chunks of paint that have been falling off of buildings that have been.
It's sort of inherent, right? When you're making art out of trash, I guess there's an inherent critique there. Maybe there always has been. It's like when Schwitters was collecting things during the Weimar Republic. It was on one hand what was at hand, and on the other, it's like, look at all this weird stuff, including Deutschmarks. You're supposed to be able to buy things with this, and you can't. So it becomes an art material with a laden history. That's the other thing, is materials always have histories, they always have pasts, and they are reflected in the collages. You can kind of work right back from the image to what it might have been, but it's transformed once it's put into the collage with other elements.
Well, that's the other thing. I guess I think of them as having a push-pull because they are presented, it's junk presented as art, and it's not ugly junk. I mean, it is carefully constructed, composed junk. So are you trying to rescue it from?
I think it kind of like you with some of your drawing and so forth, it's about paying attention. And it kind of goes back to these John Cage ideas of, well, what constitutes noise? What constitutes ugly? What constitutes any of these things? They're things that we apply to the world and to objects, but they have no inherent basis. So that's always interesting to me. It's like, well, why would you say that's beautiful or ugly? That's just a categorization that we've made up somewhere along the line and we can't seem to let go of. What's interesting is that what inspired a lot of the current collages is the way you find posters on streets in big cities where they're half torn away by people and the weather and that sort of thing. And there's an energy to those I always found interesting and I think a beauty to them. And I've tried to maintain that sort of energy in them. And some of the collages look very much like you might find them on the street, but they have been recomposed of found elements.
I think it's also interesting that they, at least sort of recently, have contained images of art in them.
Yeah.
So art posters from all different.
Which, the first iteration of that was probably intuitive and accidental, but subsequently I've thought about it, obviously more than that, and it adds yet another layer because you're collaging an image of another artwork.
Meta.
There we go, meta. And it takes you into another direction. Obviously, the intent and the meaning of that work has changed over time. It's changed by its reproduction. It's changed by its being a fragment within one of my collages next to an advertising image. But it's really interesting to me how when you talk to people how they view art, very often they come in with a set of expectations, and we all have our baggage that we bring to the experience of looking at art. And I try to teach students at school or anyone else who will listen. It's like, try to enter these spaces with as little as that as possible, and let the work sort of come to you, to speak to you, to emanate. Because a lot of what we say we don't like about artwork or music or whatever it is, it's habitual patterns that we've adopted, and we have to break all that down.
This sounds very John Berger to me too. Some of the things that you're
Yeah, I mean, it does go back to
we are both super duper fans of.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously he parsed out how art becomes image and what that means in the world of images. It's still pertinent today, even more so. So yeah, the collages are interesting too, because they take maybe a moment of this flux of images and they still it so that you can return to it and contemplate it, which is ironic because all this stuff was in flux at one point. So it's almost like this little vignette of the flux of images, and then there's another vignette that allows us to look at them and analyze them more closely. So Leigh Ann, why did you decide to become an artist, or did you?
No, I didn't decide.
It found you?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because I believe I was just wired this way. I really never even considered doing anything else.
No, I did.
Well, no, that was foolish.
I still do on some level, obviously, right?
Yeah, I guess we decide to do it every time we get up and go to the studio, eh?
Yeah. But of course, there's this life and bills and all that stuff. So I think I, like so many art students coming from middle-class backgrounds, with equivocal support from the family. It's like, that's great, but so I thought about medical illustration, but I think fortunately early on when I was still in school, I started working in museums and started framing art and hanging art and installing art and designing exhibitions. So I was still in the realm of art. I got to play with it a lot. I learned a lot about it. I got my brain thinking better about it through those processes. So it was, it wasn't totally distant from my life as an artist, although it was separate, obviously, in many ways. And it remains that way. I go to work when you can still go to work. And I install exhibitions, I write about exhibitions, I write about artists. We have conversations with other artists. There's a whole sort of biome of our art world and understanding that, rubs up against my making, but isn't the same thing.
My mama tells me my first words were "see pretty."
And we should maybe break that down. What does that mean, see pretty? Does that mean look for beauty, or does that mean see beautifully?
Maybe both.
Yeah.
Let's go with that.
Okay.
We'll go with the big.
So, but it was always present in your life. You always made work.
Always made work.
Yeah, I did.
I wasn't encouraged, but was not encouraged.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. My making kind of was encouraged, up to a point. So I think, like I tell people all the time, when they say, "Oh, I wish I had talent," or "I wish I could draw," it's like artists are just the people who didn't stop drawing as children, right? They just kept going with it.
Yeah, I think it's just an imperative, it's
a way of understanding the world.
Yeah, and it's not like it's not like you decide. I mean, I guess it is probably for some people that.
I don't know. It's like, well, and then the other thing is, it's not like we had a choice to be like stockbrokers or something. And I do, like I mentioned, a lot of other things that aren't art making, but they're related to art.
But see, the funny thing is, when I did like that, I had a picture frame shop for, I don't know, 10 years or something. Maybe it wasn't quite that long. But at any rate, it was successful. But the problem was I worked a lot and really hard, and there wasn't much time.
Yeah, this is of course, the same issue now.
Yep, students all the time, they're graduating, and what should I do so I can make art? And it's like, wow, I don't know.
You fit in around jobs and marriages and babies, and dogs and cats,
Parents and
parents, everything. Yeah. We have a friend who says dentists have practices. So that the whole nomenclature of professionalism has been infused into art for the last 20 or 30 years now, and I also resist it a little bit too because it isn't quite like other things, and it shouldn't be quite like other things, or else why do it? So, but to set that little beef aside for a minute about practice, how does drawing fit into your practice? And you sort of started answering that in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think about drawing as a way of understanding the world, of figuring things out. Again, I think it's just like the wiring, but I see a tree or a flower or water or anything, and I want to understand it. And I want to understand it by looking at it carefully, and that for me means drawing. And then the drawing, then at some point kind of transforms into art.
Another interesting thing about materials for you, not just in your drawing, but in the breadth of your practice with sculpture, with some of the other three-dimensional things you make, and also with the paintings now, there's a linearity to a lot of the materials. You use these handmade nets of jute that you've created for sculptural installations. They're obviously a linear thing. They literally tie some of the elements together. They also refer to textiles and woven things.
Semi-permeable membranes.
Yeah. So, it's interesting how materials can embody really well without a lot of fuss, the concept of what you're doing.
I think that's important for both of us, this idea of using a material that's appropriate to the content. And like in the case of watercolors, I love the idea that you're using water or something that flows to talk about those very things. I think that is true of your collecting.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that kind of feeds into this is something we hit on earlier, in that the materials themselves that we are interested in and choose to use for our work, they come with all sorts of associations already. They're already pretty profound in that way, right? They carry a lot with them. And one of the things I've been more aware of in my work over the years is to try and be less willful about it, because I think the materials alone, when you really have a dialogue with them, they will sort of indicate where they need to go. And
let the materials do what they want to do.
Right. Yeah. And it's sort of like working with any other tool. If you're using it properly, the tool is doing an awful lot of the work. You're not forcing it to do something. And especially on a conceptual level, I don't want the work to be forced.
Right.
That it remains open to a variety of interpretation, that it remains some delicious ambiguity within the work, that I'm not making a visual essay and trying to argue just a single point with a collage or anything else.
And I just have always been really drawn to materials. I mean, the what I think everybody would call beautiful materials, things like textiles, like fabrics, but plastic tubing is pretty awesome too.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And it's fun to yank them out of whatever context they were designed for, which is usually a fairly narrowly defined thing, and then repurpose them, as they say.
But then still allowing them to do what they're supposed to do,
right,
but in this different context.
Because we still know what tubing was supposed to do when
right.
we reincorporated it.
Or screws, or
yeah,
whatever.
Yeah. But what else would you want to talk about regarding your work in relation to this particular exhibition?
Well, I'm really happy to be part of it. I think it's going to be really exciting to have a bunch of people with totally different ideas and approaches to drawing, all in the same place, and I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah.
I think I probably need to say a little bit more about drawing since it's less obvious in my work.
Oh yeah. Go. Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of people will come into a show like this and expect to see, graphite on paper or some version of that. But I know that there's going to be a number of works that are dissimilar from this. There'll be mine. There'll be other people's whose idea of drawing kind of pushes out from the expected, I guess.
Well, it is interesting because a line is a construction. They're not
Yes.
there, and so you're making lines by abutting materials or overlapping materials.
Yeah,
It's
my
making a
boundaries
line.
are more real in a sense than the drawn line. It's a material reality. It's not a platonic creation. So it's interesting because when I was a student, I was primarily a printmaker, and I was doing conventional types of drawing on lithograph stone and making prints from them. So there's a background in a sort of traditional approach to drawing that I still occasionally use on side projects and stuff. But in the collages, what supplants the graphite drawn line are these torn edges, whether I've torn them or found them torn. These cut lines, whether I've cut them or I've found them cut. But they all become, they function as lines essentially. Like they lead you through the work visually in a way. They demark boundaries of one area and material from another.
And in that sort of Duchampian way, a lot of this writing that you see is actually someone else's writing. So
Exactly, yeah.
yeah.
So, that brings in the found aspect to it, but there are lots of found drawings essentially
Right.
in works like this. And then, I obviously add some in my tearing and decisions to leave something wrinkled or not, but the drawing in the sense of the collages becomes direct physical operation on the materials. You've got the paper, you're tearing it, you're cutting it, rather than doing something on it, you're doing something with it. And in that sense, there's a more material approach to it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One thing interesting with your work with the cereal bag drawings is that a lot of those drawings, and the ones that just preceded the cereal bags, were reductive drawings,
Oh yeah.
which I enjoyed a great deal. So you would take your mylar or whatever, and you would coat it with the graphite, and then you would pull away the graphite to create the image.
Which allows the light to go through because they were on mylar, a polyester base. So again, it was just kind of a different approach to that idea of semi-permeable membrane. Starting with an obscured surface and revealing.
Yeah, letting the light through it.
Right.
Yeah, and a lot of those earlier ones had, because graphite's a metal, they have a little bit of the feeling of a daguerreotype or a tin type. Yeah. At a certain angle, the graphite reflects back instead of just being a dead dark, which was interesting. And a lot of those drawings before the bags were of netted materials or trees or similar things.
Bob Knott, who was a colleague, now deceased, sadly, but I think he got me started on that because he brought back from a trip to Maine. He had a house up there. Anyway, a lobster bait trap, which is basically a little. Well, I think I said that wrong, but at any rate, it's a little netted bag that they put the bait in the lobster trap for, and trying to figure out how the knots were made because it was clearly handmade.
It's a little bit funnel shaped, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's what got me going on those. And in that case, in the case of a trap, what gets in and what comes
it's
out.
Like it's a membrane within a membrane in that case. So interesting. And then seeing that that history of that material and having watched you work through it, it's like taking that item and sort of taking from it what you needed to make your own nets for your own sort of trapping of, in many cases, an installation sort of trapping of time as history, and that sort of thing, which is really,
with the revenants.
yeah, which is really interesting. So, but yeah, I think drawing is very visibly, you know, a foundation for your work, and it's a little less clear for a lot of people in mind, but I think it exists.
Yeah, I think when you open up the idea, and it certainly has been opened up more recently. You know, I think about like Julie Meritu, or I don't know, a zillion other people. I mean, I guess they call her works paintings, but I think of them as drawings.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this seems really obviously to me a drawing. So, or you know, the way people now will use comics. I mean, they've been using comics for a long time, but I think in a different kind of way now. Anyway, yeah, I think the whole idea of what a drawing is has really opened up, and for different ends too. You know, for different conceptual reasons, and yeah.
Yeah, you know, you think about the Renaissance idea of a drawing, and for the most part, it was the basis leading to a painting, right? It was a study towards a drawing that became the undergirding for the painting.
And having just seen, what was it, last year, we got to see Leonardo in London.
Yeah, and of course,
oh my word,
Leonardo didn't even call himself an artist, and probably would not have thought of his drawings as something, you know, worthwhile of special attention. They were things he used as tools, essentially. But our idea of drawing has changed markedly.
Yeah,
you know?
But talk about trying to figure things out. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. But drawing, I think, naturally has an analytic side, because, especially if it's based on observation, it's like you looking at the thing and the mind in the hand trying to work that out.
Yeah. And it's a lovely thing when you get those all in sync.